snow does something strange to sound. It swallows it. A battalion of men can move through deep snow in a pine forest and make less noise than a single truck on a dry road. And if you have never stood in that kind of silence, you cannot really imagine how loud your own breathing becomes inside it. On the night of January 3, 1945, in the woods north of a Belgian market town called Bastogne, several hundred men of the 1st SS Panzer Division moved through exactly that silence toward an American position they had been told was thin, exhausted, and ready to come apart. They were not wrong about exhausted. The Americans in front of them had been in the line for more than 2 weeks in temperatures that froze plasma in the bottle. They had been shelled, strafed, encircled, and told to hold ground that made no sense to hold. Some of them had not had a hot meal since the middle of December. Some of them were wearing German overcoats, taken off German dead, because the army had never gotten them winter clothing. So the intelligence was accurate, thin, exhausted. Ready to come apart is where it fell down. I want to be careful here, because this is a story that has been told badly a lot of times, and the bad versions have a particular shape. They have swelling music and slow-motion snow, and a German officer somewhere writing a beautiful sentence about American courage that no historian has ever been able to find in an actual archive. There are entire videos built on quotations that do not exist, attributed to officers who never existed, in units that were nowhere near the town. The real thing is better. That is the part that gets me. The real record of what the Germans said about the 101st Airborne is sitting in the National Archives in College Park, Maryland, in a collection of manuscripts that almost nobody outside a narrow slice of the historical profession has ever read, and it is stranger and colder and more damning than anything a scriptwriter would invent. Because here is what happened after the war. The United States Army had a problem. It had just fought the largest campaign in its history against an enemy whose internal records were scattered, burned, or buried, and it wanted to understand what the war had looked like from the other side of the hill. So it did something that still strikes me as remarkable. It gathered up several hundred captured German generals and staff officers, put them in a compound in Germany under the supervision of Franz Halder, the former chief of the German General Staff, gave them paper and pencils, and paid them to write down what they had done and why it had failed. They produced something like 2,500 manuscripts. Division commanders, corps commanders, army commanders, men who had spent 4 years learning to write clean, dry, unsentimental operational prose, now sitting in a requisition building in a country that no longer existed, reconstructing from memory the worst weeks of their professional lives for an audience of American historians. Those documents are the closest thing we will ever have to an honest answer to the question in the title of this video. Not a quotation someone made up. The actual words of the actual men who tried to take Bastogne, written down while it was all still fresh, with no reason left to lie, and every reason to explain themselves. And what they said is not what you expect. To get there, though, you have to start with the men they were writing about. And you have to start earlier than December. The 101st Airborne Division came into existence on the 16th of August 1942 at Camp Claiborne, Louisiana, in a country that had been at war for 8 months and had almost nothing to show for it yet. Its first commander was a Virginian named William Lee, who had spent years arguing with skeptical superiors that men could be dropped out of aircraft into the enemy's rear and still function as a fighting formation. On the day of activation, he told the division it had no history at all. What it had, he said, was a rendezvous with destiny. That line has been printed on so many things since that it has worn smooth. But read it again in context. He was talking to a collection of farm kids and factory hands and college dropouts who had volunteered for a branch of service that did not exist yet, in an army that was still figuring out how to feed itself. He was not describing what they were. He was describing a debt they had not yet been asked to pay. The training that followed has been mythologized to the point of caricature, and I understand why people roll their eyes at it, but the underlying facts are hard to argue with. At Camp Toccoa in Georgia, the parachute regiments ran a mountain called Currahee, 3 miles up and 3 miles down, in boots, often twice a day. Washout rates in some of those early companies ran past 50%. Officers were washed out at the same rate as enlisted men, sometimes higher, which was almost unheard of in the American Army of that era. But the physical filter is not the interesting part. Plenty of armies produced physically hard men. The Wehrmacht produced them by the hundreds of thousands, and the men who came out of the Soviet winter had endured things no American training program would have dared simulate. What the American Airborne program was actually selecting for was something narrower and stranger. It was selecting for men who reacted to catastrophe by getting more organized instead of less. Think about the operational problem. You put a battalion in aircraft at night, over occupied Europe, in weather nobody can predict, and you throw them out over a landscape they have only seen on a sand table. Some of them are going to land in the right field. Most of them are not. Radios break on impact. Bundles vanish into hedgerows. Officers land 2 miles from their companies. Within 20 minutes of the drop, the plan on paper is worthless. So the entire system was built around a single assumption. The plan will fail, and the men will have to construct a new one, in the dark, alone, from whatever pieces are within walking distance. A private who found himself with 6 strangers from 3 different regiments was not supposed to hide. He was supposed to figure out who was senior, pick a direction, and start causing problems. That is a psychological product, not a physical one. And it is the thing the Germans could not account for later, because it does not show up on any of the tables an intelligence officer uses to estimate an enemy. Normandy was the first bill. The 101st jumped in the small hours of the 6th of June and landed scattered across a stretch of the Cotentin Peninsula that the Germans had partially flooded. Men drowned in fields under 4 feet of water, dragged down by equipment they could not cut loose in time. Whole sticks came down miles from their drop zones. By dawn, a large fraction of the division had no idea where it was, and by the end of the day the causeways behind Utah Beach were open, the guns at Bracourt were silenced, and the German command in the sector had concluded from the sheer geographic spread of American paratroopers that they were facing a far larger force than had actually jumped. The chaos of a scattered drop, entirely by accident, produced its own kind of terror. Then came Holland. Market Garden, September 1944, and the 101st was on the ground for 72 days, holding a 2-lane road through open country that the men started calling Hell's Highway because the Germans cut it almost daily. That was not the clean airborne operation anyone had imagined. It was 2.5 months of ordinary, grinding, unairborne infantry work, and it hollowed the division out. When they finally came off the line in late November, they went to Mourmelon-le-Grand, an old French army camp near Reims, and what they needed was obvious to anyone who looked at them. Replacements, winter clothing, boots, ammunition, medical supplies, rest. What they got was about 3 weeks, and not much of any of it. Weapons were away being repaired. Uniforms were away being replaced. Men were on leave in Paris. The division's commander, Maxwell Taylor, was in Washington arguing about post-war airborne doctrine, which left the artillery commander, a brigadier general named Anthony McAuliffe, minding the store. 60 miles east, in the fog on the German border, 190,000 men and 1,000 armored vehicles were sitting in the trees under radio silence, waiting. The plan they were waiting to execute had come from Hitler personally, over the objections of essentially every senior officer who saw it. 3 armies would attack through the Ardennes, the same forested, hilly, road-poor country the German army had used to humiliate France in 1940 and drive to Antwerp, splitting the American and British armies, taking the port, forcing a negotiated peace in the West so that everything could be turned around and thrown at the Russians. 2 of those armies matter for this story. In the north, the 6th Panzer Army under Sepp Dietrich, built around the SS divisions and given the shortest route to the objective and the best of the fuel. In the center, the 5th Panzer Army under Hasso von Manteuffel, a small, sharp, professional soldier who had fought in Russia and North Africa and who, unlike a lot of people in that headquarters, actually understood what the roads in the Ardennes were like in December. Manteuffel's army had a road problem. Only a limited number of routes could take armored traffic through that country, and a large number of them passed through one town, Bastogne. 7 paved roads met there, not 4, not 5. 7. On the map, it looks like a spider. If you are trying to move Panzer divisions west on a schedule measured in hours, you do not go around Bastogne, because going around means single-lane forest tracks that turn to gray soup under the weight of a panther. You go through it. The attack came at 5:30 on the morning of the 16th of December, out of fog so thick that men in the American forward positions heard the German infantry before they saw anything at all. The first 2 days were a disaster for the Americans, and everyone knows it. 2 regiments of the 106th Infantry Division, green in the line 11 days, were surrounded on the Schnee Eifel and surrendered in the thousands. Command posts were overrun. Telephone lines were cut. Reports contradicted each other so badly that senior headquarters spent a full day arguing about whether this was a local spoiling attack or something worse. And in the north, Kampfgruppe Peiper came through. I want to spend a moment here because it matters for what comes later. Jochen Peiper commanded the armored spearhead of the 1st SS Panzer Division, and his orders were to move fast and not worry about his flanks. On the 17th of December, at a crossroads near the hamlet of Bastogne, southeast of Malmedy, his men captured a convoy of American artillery observers. They herded roughly 120 prisoners into a field. Then they opened fire on them with machine guns. 84 Americans died there. Some survived by lying still under the bodies of their friends and running when it got dark. The same day, in a village called Wereth, 11 black soldiers from the 333rd Field Artillery Battalion, who had been sheltered by a Belgian family, were taken by SS troops, tortured, and shot. They were found in the spring when the snow melted. Word of Malmedy moved through the American lines faster than any official communication in the entire campaign. By the 18th, men who had no idea where the front line was knew that the SS were shooting prisoners. It changed how the fighting was conducted for the rest of the winter, on both sides, and not in a gentle direction. Which brings us to the trucks. On the night of the 17th in Mourmelon, the 101st was told it was moving. Not in the morning. Now. Men were pulled out of movie theaters. Officers went into Reims to physically drag paratroopers out of bars. Ammunition was issued in whatever quantities happened to be on hand, which in some companies meant less than a basic load. There were not enough helmets. There were not enough overshoes. There were, in a lot of cases, not enough rifles, because the rifles were in an ordnance depot somewhere being rebuilt. They loaded onto open cattle trucks, 10-ton semi-trailers meant for hauling cargo, and drove 100 miles north through the night with the headlights on, because the situation was bad enough that the risk of air attack mattered less than the risk of arriving late. Every man who wrote about that ride afterward wrote about the same thing. Not the cold, though it was brutal, standing up in an open trailer at 30 miles an hour in December. What they wrote about was the traffic coming the other way. The road was full of Americans going the wrong direction. Trucks, jeeps, ambulances, men walking. Some of them had thrown away their weapons. Some had no idea what unit they belonged to anymore. They were shouting things at the paratroopers as they passed, and the things they were shouting were not encouraging. Here is the detail I cannot stop thinking about. The paratroopers, short of ammunition, started asking the retreating men to hand over what they had. Bandoliers, grenades, bazooka rounds. In several accounts, the retreating soldiers simply gave it to them, without much discussion, the way you hand over something you no longer have any use for. And then the trucks kept going toward the sound. They came into Bastogne in the small hours of the 19th of December. Roughly 11,000 men of the 101st, and they were not alone, though the movie version usually forgets this. Combat Command B of the 10th Armored Division was already there under Colonel William Roberts, and he had done something quietly decisive. Instead of holding his armor concentrated as a mobile reserve, he split it into 3 task forces and pushed them out along the eastern approach roads to hit the German columns while they were still moving. Team Cherry went east toward Longville. Team O'Hara went southeast toward Warden. Team de Sobry went north to a crossroads village called Noville with about 400 men and 15 Shermans. Those three teams are the reason there was a Bastogne to defend. They were not supposed to hold. They were supposed to buy hours, and they did, and most of them were destroyed doing it. At Noville, on high ground 3 miles north of town, Major William de Sobry's task force woke on the morning of the 20th to fog and the sound of engines. When the fog tore open around 10 in the morning, there were somewhere between 30 and 40 German tanks in the open fields in front of them, from the 2nd Panzer Division, moving west. The 1st Battalion of the 506th Parachute Infantry had come up to join them under Lieutenant Colonel James Laprade. Together, 400 armored troops and a battalion of paratroopers, with no heavy weapons to speak of, they fought a full Panzer Division to a standstill in front of that village for a day and a half. Laprade was killed by a shell that came through the wall of the command post. De Sobry was badly wounded in the same blast and was captured later at an aid station the Germans overran. When the survivors finally pulled back to Foy on the 20th, they had lost more than half their strength. They had also taken the sting out of the northern thrust and cost the Germans a day they did not have. By the evening of the 21st of December, the ring closed. Roughly 18,000 Americans inside a perimeter about 16 miles around. The 101st, the remains of CCB, the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, engineers, stragglers from a dozen shattered units, and 2 field artillery battalions, the 969th and the 333rd, manned largely by black soldiers in a segregated army, whose guns fired in support of the perimeter through the entire siege. The 969th would come out of it with a Distinguished Unit Citation, the first ever awarded to a black combat unit. Almost nobody knows that, and it deserves better. Inside the perimeter there was no relief, no evacuation of the wounded, and increasingly no ammunition. Artillery batteries went on to rationing so severe that battalion fire missions were being approved by name. 10 rounds per gun per day in some batteries. Gunners were told to shoot only if they could see what they were shooting at and were sure it mattered, and the weather sat on top of them. Low cloud, fog, ice fog, snow, no air resupply, no close air support. The temperature dropped and stayed down. Men in foxholes got trench foot in numbers that took entire squads out of the line. Wounded men who lay out between positions did not last long, because the cold finished what the shell fragment started. The Germans besieging the town were not, at this point, the SS. This is the thing the popular version always gets wrong, and I think the truth is more interesting anyway. The units that ringed Bastogne in December belonged to the 47th Panzer Corps under General Heinrich von Luttwitz, the 26th Volksgrenadier Division under Heinz Kokott, elements of the 2nd Panzer Division, and Panzer Lehr under Fritz Bayerlein, a division built out of the German Army's own demonstration and training units, and considered one of the best instructed armored formations in the Wehrmacht. These were professionals. Kokott had been on the Eastern Front. Bayerlein had served under Rommel in Africa and had fought the Americans across Normandy. They were not amateurs, and they were not fanatics. They were exactly the kind of officers whose written assessments you should take seriously. On the morning of the 22nd of December, 4 Germans came down the Arlon Road under a white flag, a major named Wagner, a lieutenant named Henke who spoke English, and 2 enlisted men. They were met by a sergeant from F Company of the 327th Glider Infantry, blindfolded, and walked back through the lines with a typed document. The document was von Luttwitz's ultimatum, and it was written in the polite, formal, faintly theatrical register that German staff officers used for that sort of thing. It observed that the American forces were encircled, that a serious German armored push had reached the Meuse, and that the honorable course now was surrender. 2 hours to think about it. If not, the artillery would be turned on the town and the civilian population in it, and the responsibility for what followed would be American. It reached McAuliffe in the basement of the Heinz barracks. He had been asleep. Somebody told him the Germans had sent a written demand, and in the confusion he apparently thought for a second that it was the Germans who wanted to surrender. When it was explained to him, he read it, made a noise of disgust, and dropped it on the floor. The word he said was nuts. Later, when his staff needed something to actually type on the reply, an officer suggested that his first reaction had been about right. So the reply went out with almost nothing on it. The addressee, that one word, the signature line. Colonel Joseph Harper carried it back to the German parlementaires at the edge of the perimeter, and they did not understand it. They asked whether it was affirmative or negative. Harper told them it was decidedly not affirmative, and then, when they still looked blank, translated it into the plainest English available, which was an instruction to go to hell. It has become a joke, that word. A regimental motto, a tourist gift shop, a bit of Americana, and I think we have lost track of how much weight was actually sitting behind it. McAuliffe had almost no artillery ammunition. He had wounded men stacked in a garage on the Rue Neufchâteau with a single surgeon who had never been trained as a surgeon. He had no air support and no relief, and a written promise from a German corps commander that the town would be shelled into rubble. He said no anyway, and the men on the perimeter, when the word came around, apparently found it hilarious. That reaction tells you more about the state of that garrison than any medal citation. The Germans, for their part, did shell the town. But the thing von Lüttwitz had actually needed was for the Americans to say yes, because he did not have the strength to take Bastogne by assault, and he knew it. His divisions were being pulled in two directions at once, ordered to keep pushing west, while simultaneously eliminating a garrison that was sitting on their supply road. That is not a plan. That is a compromise between two plans. And Kokot in particular would write about it afterward with a bitterness you can still feel through the translation. Then, on the 23rd of December, the sky cleared. A high-pressure system moved in from the east, the kind of clear, hard, bitter cold that makes the air feel like glass, and the Allied air forces came off the ground for the first time in a week. Pathfinders jumped into the perimeter that morning to set up beacons. And then, through the day, C-47s came over Bastogne in streams and dropped somewhere around 140 tons of supplies in parachute bundles of red, yellow, and blue. Men climbed out of holes and ran into open fields under artillery fire to drag those bundles in. The artillery ammunition situation went from desperate to merely bad. And overhead the fighter bombers went to work on the German columns that had spent a week moving freely under the cloud. That was the turn. Not a heroic charge. Weather. Christmas Eve was not merciful. German bombers came over Bastogne after dark and hit the town, and one of the bombs came down on the building on the Rue Neufchâteau that was serving as the main aid station for the 20th Armored Infantry Battalion. Around 30 wounded Americans died in the fire. So did a Belgian woman named Renée Lemaire. She was a nurse from Bastogne, 30 years old, who had volunteered to work in that aid station and had spent days cleaning wounds and holding the hands of men who were dying a long way from home. She was in the building when it came down. The surgeon, a young doctor named Jack Pryor, who had been an internist 3 years earlier and was now doing amputations by lamplight, wrote about her for the rest of his life. There was a second nurse there, a Congolese Belgian woman named Augusta Chiwi, who had been turned away from at least one American position because of her skin and who kept working anyway. She was blown through a wall by the same blast and survived. She lived until 2011 in Brussels, and for most of that time nobody knew who she was. She had never told anyone. That is worth sitting with for a second, because it happens constantly with this generation and this war. Augusta Chiwi went 65 years without telling the story, and it only came out because a historian went looking. Renée Lemaire's name is on a plaque in Bastogne now because Jack Pryor refused to let it be forgotten and wrote about her in an article decades later. Both of those stories nearly vanished, not because they were unimportant, but because nobody had gone through the paper. And there is always paper. That is the part families do not believe until they see it. The American Army in 1944 was an enormous bureaucracy that wrote things down obsessively. Morning reports listing every man present, sick, wounded, or missing on a given day. unit journals kept hour by hour, casualty cards, hospital admission records, award citations that describe an afternoon in a Belgian field in more detail than the man ever described it at home. Most of it survives. Almost none of it is where people expect it to be. If you have a photograph of a young man in a uniform and nobody left alive who can tell you what he did, that is not a dead end. It is a starting point. I wrote a book about how to work it, how to go from a name, a picture, and a box of unexplained objects to an actual reconstructed service record. It is called Find Your Grandfather's War, and the link is in the description. If there is a shoebox in your family that nobody has opened properly, that is what it was written for. Because a man's whole war can be sitting in a folder in Missouri with nobody's name on the request slip. Christmas morning in Bastogne came at about 4 in the afternoon on the 25th, in the sense that the fighting started long before it and did not stop when it was over. Before dawn, the Germans made their most serious attempt of the entire siege, and they made it in the west, where the Americans were thinnest. Kokot's 26th Volksgrenadiers and a regiment from the 15th Panzergrenadier Division attacked toward the villages of Champs and Hemrula with about 18 tanks painted white. They came in fast, split into 2 groups, and one group actually punched clean through the American line and got into open ground behind it. What happened next is one of the more remarkable small actions of the war, and it happened because of where the 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion had parked. American tank destroyers, dug in and camouflaged along the tree line, caught the German armor in the open from the flank at short range. The 502nd Parachute Infantry, under Lieutenant Colonel Steve Chapuis, turned and fought in 2 directions at once. Glider infantry from the 327th held their positions with tanks physically driving past them. At Champs, a machine gunner named Willis Fowler had his gun sighted on a slope where he could see the German infantry crossing open snow. He fired until his gun was empty, and the attack in front of him stopped existing. He was a corporal. He was doing exactly the thing the training had been designed to produce. The man on the flank who does not leave. Every one of those 18 tanks was destroyed. All of them. By late morning, the westward attack was over, and the men in Bastogne ate whatever they could find, which in some units was cold beans and in others was nothing. McAuliffe had a Christmas message mimeographed and passed around the perimeter. He listed off what the division had done. He mentioned the ultimatum, printed the German demand in full, printed his one-word reply under it, and told the men they had a Merry Christmas coming to them and the privilege of knowing exactly what they had done to earn it. The next afternoon, at about 4:20 on the 26th of December, a Sherman from Company C of the 37th Tank Battalion, part of Creighton Abrams Combat Command in the 4th Armored Division, came up the road from Assenois shooting at everything on both sides, and its commander, Lieutenant Charles Bogus, spotted engineers in American uniforms near a pillbox. The corridor was open. Everyone thinks that is where the story ends. That is where the movies end. Relief column, handshake, credits. It is not where the story ends. It is where the SS come in. Because the siege being broken did not mean the battle was over. It meant Bastogne stopped being a pocket and started being the hinge of the entire southern shoulder, and the German command, having failed to take it by encirclement, decided to take it by assault. Through late December and into January, they fed in more force, not less. And that is when the units arrived that the title of this video is about. The 1st SS Panzer Division, Leibstandarte Adolf Hitler, Piper's Parent Formation, pulled out of the north where its offensive had died in the mud and the fuel shortage, and swung south toward Bastogne. The 12th SS Panzer Division, Hitlerjugend, came the same way. The Führer Begleit Brigade. Additional Volksgrenadier divisions. They came into the sector in the first days of January and attacked into the woods north and northeast of the town, into the Bois Jacques and the Bois Champé, into the ground around Foy and Rican and Noville, against the same division that had already been in that line for 2.5 weeks. If you want the single most concentrated moment of the whole thing, it is the 3rd of January 1945 in the Bois Jacques, And it was not an infantry assault at all. It was artillery. Shelling in a pine forest does something specific and horrible. The shells burst in the treetops instead of the ground, and the fragments and the splintered wood come straight down into the holes, which means the one thing infantry instinctively does under fire, get low and stay low, is the thing that gets you killed. The correct response is to get out of the hole and press yourself against a tree trunk, which requires you to stand up and walk around during a barrage. Some men could do it, some could not. The 506th took that barrage in the woods above Foy on the 3rd of January and lost men by the handful in minutes. That is the day Joe Toye lost a leg out in the open, and Bill Guarnere went out of his hole to drag him back and lost one too. Both of them from Easy Company. Both of them men who had been in it since Normandy. The SS attacked into that. And the line moved in places by a few hundred yards, and then stopped. The town was never taken. The woods were never cleared of Americans. On the 13th of January, the 506th went down the slope into Foy and took it back, and by the end of the month the Germans in that sector were fighting to get out of Belgium rather than through it. The 101st came out of the Ardennes with roughly 2,500 casualties. Around 340 men killed, 1,600 or 1,700 wounded, 500 or so missing. You will see the number 19,000 thrown around online for the division at Bastogne, and it is nonsense. That is roughly the American killed for the entire Ardennes campaign, all units, 6 weeks. The real number is smaller, and it does not need inflating. 2,500 casualties out of 11,000 men, in a month in that cold, is a wound that a division feels for the rest of its existence. So, the archives. When those German officers sat down after the war to write their manuscripts, the ones who had been at Bastogne wrote about it at length, and the striking thing about those accounts is what they do not contain. They do not contain much about American equipment. That surprised me the first time I went through them. You would expect the losing side to explain itself with material. They had more tanks, they had more shells, they had the Air Force. The German officers at Bastogne mention all of that, but it is not where their analysis lives, and in the December phase it would have been a hard argument to make anyway, since for most of the siege the Americans inside the town had less of everything than the men outside it. What they write about instead is a planning failure. And underneath the planning failure, something they clearly found more disturbing, which is that their estimates of American behavior were wrong in a consistent direction. Kokot, commanding the 26th Volksgrenadier Division, was the officer with the most direct responsibility for reducing the town, and his manuscript is the most detailed. What comes through it is a man describing a job that kept changing shape in his hands. He was ordered to contain Bastogne and also to advance west. He was told the garrison was disorganized and would collapse under pressure, and instead every probe he sent found positions that fought and did not withdraw, and every attack he mounted cost him strength he could not replace. He describes the Americans reacting faster than he expected them to. He describes his own men, many of them replacements, being asked to do something with a shrinking margin every day. Bayerlein at Panzer Lehr wrote in the same register, and he had form on this. He had already spent the summer in Normandy learning that American units did not behave the way German intelligence estimates said they would. He was blunt about the underlying decision, which he considered a mistake. Bastogne should have been taken on the 18th or 19th of December, before the paratroopers were established, when it was held by a scratch force and there was still an open road into it. Instead, the Corps hesitated, split its effort, tried to do two things, and by the time it committed to taking the town, it was attacking a defense rather than seizing a road junction. Von Lüttwitz, the man who had sent the surrender demand, wrote about Bastogne as the thing that broke the offensive's timetable. Manteuffel, commanding the army, was harder still, and he was writing about the whole plan. Not enough fuel, not enough infantry, too little road, too much ambition, an objective that was never reachable with the force available. He had said as much before the attack, to Hitler's face, and been overruled. None of it is poetic. There are no lines in those manuscripts about American souls. What there is instead is a group of professional soldiers, riding separately, reaching the same conclusion from different directions. The plan required the Americans to do a specific thing, and the Americans did not do it. The specific thing was to give ground. Everything in German operational doctrine for a fast offensive depended on it. You concentrate armor, you hit a weak point, you rupture the line, and the defenders on either side of the rupture pull back to avoid being cut off, which widens the gap, which lets you pour through. It works because it is what trained troops are supposed to do. Withdrawing from an untenable position is not cowardice, it is correct practice, taught in every army on earth, including that one. At Bastogne, over and over, Americans in untenable positions stayed in them, sometimes because they had orders to, sometimes because their radios were out and nobody had told them to leave, sometimes because they were paratroopers, and being cut off was a condition they had trained for so thoroughly that it did not register as an emergency. When somebody pointed out to McAuliffe's staff that they were completely surrounded, the joke that went around the perimeter was that this was the best news they had heard all week, because now they could shoot in any direction they liked and not worry about hitting friendly troops. That joke is the entire doctrine in one sentence. And the effect of it, added up across a whole division across 3 weeks, was that the German commanders lost the ability to predict what was going to happen next. That is what those manuscripts are really documenting, not admiration. A model failure. They were running a calculation that had worked in Poland and France and Russia, and it stopped returning correct answers in the Ardennes, and the officers writing in 1946 and 1947 still could not entirely explain why. I think there are 3 reasons, and none of them are flattering to anybody. The first is the training, which was designed to produce men who did not treat isolation as defeat. That is real, and it is documented, and it worked. The second is Malmedy. By the 20th of December, every American in the Ardennes knew what had happened at that crossroads. Whatever calculation a tired, frozen man might have made in his own head about the relative merits of surrender, the SS had already answered it for him. There is a hard, unsentimental logic to holding a position when you have concluded that the alternative to holding it is a field and a machine gun. The Germans did that to themselves. The third is smaller and harder to talk about. Most of the men in those holes were not thinking about the Meuse or Antwerp or the war. They were thinking about 8 or 10 other men within 30 yards of them. Every serious study of combat motivation in the 20th century comes back to the same finding, which is that men fight for the people immediately next to them and not for much else. The 101st had been together since Tokoa, through Normandy and Holland, and it had already buried enough of its own that leaving a position had come to mean leaving somebody. Those 3 things stacked on top of each other in one town in one very cold December, and the result was a defense that a professional army with more tanks, more guns, and better position could not break. There is a phrase that shows up now and then in accounts of German soldiers in the West, and I have never been able to source it to a document, so treat it as folklore rather than fact. The story goes that men in the Wehrmacht used to say a position was held in the American way when it was held past the point where holding it made any sense, and that they did not mean it kindly. Whether anyone ever really said that, I do not know. What I do know is that the sentiment shows up in the real records, with the sarcasm drained out of it. Bastogne is where the joke, if it was ever a joke, stopped being funny. Werner Kortenhaus was a tank crewman in the 21st Panzer Division. Different front, different battle, Normandy rather than the Ardennes, and I mention him only because his name has been mangled and dragged into so many videos about Bastogne that half the internet now believes he was an SS officer who wrote poetry about American paratroopers. He was not. He was a young man in a Panzer IV who survived and spent decades afterward carefully helping historians get the facts right, which is roughly the opposite of what has been done with his name. I bring it up because it matters here. The temptation with a story like this is to reach for the invented quotation, the perfect line, the German officer who says the beautiful thing. And every time somebody does that, The real record gets a little harder to see under the fiction. The real record is a stack of gray manuscripts in an archive in Maryland, written by men who lost, in the flat vocabulary of professional soldiers, saying in 100 different ways that the Americans would not move. The last thing worth saying is about the men themselves, and how little of this they were willing to discuss. Most of the 101st went home in 1945 and 1946, and became mechanics and teachers and insurance salesmen and fathers, and the overwhelming majority of them said almost nothing about Bastogne for 40 years. Not because it was classified, because there was no version of it that made sense at a dinner table. How do you explain to a 9-year-old what a tree burst does, or why you still cannot stand the sound of snow crunching, or what it was like to eat a Christmas dinner of white beans in a cellar, while a Belgian nurse's body was being carried out of a burning aid station a street away? So they did not explain it. They put the jacket in a closet. They kept a patch and a jump wing and a photograph or two and a couple of objects nobody in the family could ever identify, and they went to work. And their grandchildren are the ones now holding the box. There is a temptation, when you tell a story like this, to end on something enormous, and I do not think it earns that. What happened at Bastogne was not mystical. It was 11,000 tired men, badly equipped, in the wrong clothes, in a town they had never heard of a week earlier, who decided one hole at a time that they were not leaving, and whose enemy could not find a way to make them. The Germans went looking for language for that for the rest of their lives and mostly failed. What they left behind instead is a set of dry after-action reports full of a single, repeated, quietly astonished observation. We attacked, and they were still there. We attacked again, and they were still there.